Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another week here on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you, as always, by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for tuning in. Sorry for that weird and awkward start, a little bit of mic issues, but it's fixed now, and we are good to go for our Monday edition of the show. We start off, as always, talking about Monday Night Football. Bucs Chiefs should be a very interesting game. Another primetime game with a lot of question marks surrounding it. Then I get into my fantasy stars of the week in both the NFL and college football. Start my positional rankings with the QB position. And conclude today's show with my bold fantasy prediction / don't be surprised if segment to give you guys some interesting takes on the fantasy football week ahead. But before we get into any of that, I do want to remind you that if you want more content such as this, more exclusive short content that tells you what goes on throughout our shows, different shows around the network as well, consider liking, following, and subscribing to the show and the network as a whole. Also, if you want to interact with the show more directly, make yourselves available to the Super Chats, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. Great way to contribute and interact with the show. You can do one of two things. Either press that $sign in the comment section, leave a tip or donation, or just leave a question, comment, concern you may have throughout the show. It can be any topic concerning fantasy sports, especially fantasy football, as we are in the thick of the season. But without further ado, let's jump into today's show with our Monday Night Football betting preview. Bucs Chiefs should be a very interesting game. Before we get into it, I do want to go over. Oops, that is the wrong game. I was stuck in a Sunday night mindset. Another interesting game there between the Colts and the Vikings. Let me update that for you. Unfortunately, the wrong colors here, but still the same mindset here. Bucs Chiefs should be a good game. Kansas City, -10, -9 on the night, over under 45.5, -450 money line for Kansas City, +340 for Tampa Bay. And the reason why I think this game is another weird Monday Night Football game is because both of these teams have similar situations. Both of them have had significant injuries on their skill position front. Rashee Rice goes down early in the season for the Chiefs. Chris Godwin and Mike Evans just a couple weeks ago for the Bucs. But they're seemingly headed in different directions here. Because I feel like the Chiefs, even though they don't necessarily have much depth as the Bucs, they find ways to win no matter what against quality opposition or inferior opposition. Whereas the Bucs, you have good pieces to build around. Sans Mike Godwin and Chris Evans. But I don't necessarily know if you have the same nous or experience the Chiefs do in order to win games such as this. And you're getting into the teeth of your schedule because I believe after this Chiefs game, the Bucs do have the bye. Let me check here. Then they play the 49ers. Actually, they don't have the bye. The bye comes after the 49ers where they play the Giants. That's a light game on their schedule. They play the Panthers, Raiders, and Chargers. All winnable games to close out their season. But in order to really determine whether or not I'm all in on this Bucs team, I need to see if they can find sustained success against two very competent opponents, very solid opponents in the Chiefs now and the 49ers next week to truly show that they're contenders here. Because their backs are against the wall in the NFC South, let's not forget. And the NFC is going to be a very congested conference come the end of the season. The NFC West is a logjam right now. Nobody knows who's going to win that. The NFC North could put all four of their teams into the playoffs. And so the Bucs are in a weird position right now because they have an easy schedule to close the season. A lot of winnable games. But if you don't win now, then I can't really say that those winnable games will matter for the playoff push because you need to beat teams who are going to be there. And I believe that the Bucs feel they have a team that can make a deep playoff run once at the very least Mike Evans comes back from injury, because we know Chris Godwin's injury is season-ending. We wish him a speedy recovery. So we know what the Bucs will look like when quote-unquote fully healthy for the stretch run. But it's where they are right now. It's where they are in these two games especially. And so we're going to truly find out, and I know I keep on pinpointing this as the theme for the Bucs on the night. We're going to find out whether or not the Bucs truly have enough depth and now enough nous to beat a solid, unbeaten team at that in the Kansas City Chiefs. Because I feel like, yes, you have guys like Bucky Irving. You have guys like Cade Otton who can contribute. You have guys like Jalen McMillan with a very interesting piece to utilize. Sterling Shepard's a decent wide receiver too. But in order for everything to coalesce, I feel like this team needs a game in which they feel comfortable that all the pieces can fit together, most importantly, get them a win. And this game, unfortunately, doesn't feel like that for me. Whereas the Chiefs side of things, you feel like eventually they're going to have to slip up, but they haven't. Patrick Mahomes has been playing subpar football. Travis Kelce has shown his age. Without Rashee Rice, there's not really one wide receiver one that's separating themselves. And they're really kind of contingent on perhaps the best defense in the league right now. That's what worries me about the Bucs, because the Bucs, like I said, are well equipped to, if not contend any games, win them against inferior opponents, like I said. Because they have, I believe, some of the better depth in the league at certain positions that can really help them stay true to a certain identity. But this Chiefs defense is just so scary, so potent, so versatile in what it can do. And kudos to Spags for making them this way. And I feel like this is going to be a game of catch-up all night for the Bucs. And while I feel like, they have Baker, they have Liam Cohen, who've developed a nice rapport with each other, a nice understanding most importantly, it's going to be about trust. Because if you don't trust your identity right now, which is one of a team that doesn't necessarily have that much to rely upon, then this could go off the rails quickly. I have the Chiefs winning this game and covering the spread just because of the fact I don't think the Bucs offense can truly match up and test this Chiefs defense enough for me to consider them upsetting or covering the spread. So that's what I think about this game right now. You have two teams. One in the Chiefs that really have so many different contingency plans when things go wrong. And then the Bucs, who are a very talented team, even without Mike Evans and Chris Godwin, but just don't have the experience the Chiefs do in moments such as this, or the time, really, to have this work and coalesce. Now, if there was a bye in between this week and the 49ers game, then I would have said that this game isn't necessarily a must-win for Tampa Bay. But it feels like it now. Yes, you have a very light schedule, perhaps the easiest schedule in the league after these two games are finished and over with. But it's not going to matter if you don't show me anything or show your fans anything. So that's what I feel for the Bucs. Whereas the Chiefs, if they lose this game, so what, really? But I feel like if they do lose, a lot of alarm bells will start ringing for some reason. And I feel like, the reason why the Chiefs are so good is that because they make you feel like you should panic about them, right? When things are going wrong, Patrick Mahomes is not playing well, he's not connecting with Travis Kelce as often, his receivers aren't playing up to their standard, everything kind of feels a little bit off. But they still win football games. They're the only remaining unbeaten team in the league for a reason, and that is because they have a system that works whenever things go awry. And that's what separates them from the rest of the league. They're a team that, even if they look bad, you still have little to no worries about, just because of their record and their standing right now. Whereas the Bucs, they're trying to get to this level. In my mind, I view the Bucs kind of like a mini-me version of the Chiefs. They have the depth, they have the players, they have the excitement surrounding them. They just don't have the experience without guys like Mike Evans and Chris Godwin to really compete against teams like the Chiefs and Niners. So this is kind of like the game will prove to be the trial by fire what the Bucs think they are. That makes sense. Because the Chiefs are the pariahs right now of the NFL. The Bucs are the protégés. They're kind of looking up to the pedestal of trying to reach that pinnacle the Chiefs have. But they haven't really put everything together. And this could prove to be one of those games where everything comes crashing down, like I said, for the Bucs. Now, in terms of the NFC playoff picture, if they lose, they're still in it. But they're not really in it in the sense that they can win their division and they have a respectable game at home. No, this is clearly a team that's going to have to sneak into the wild card picture and make do with what they get in the first round. So it's really going to come down to, for the Bucs, whether or not they can act a little bit Chiefs-like in these two games and show us something that matters and that is of quality, or on the Chiefs side of things, just continue being who you are and proving that the Bucs still are a team a couple pegs below you in the pecking order. So this game is going to be interesting. It's going to be fun. I hope that the Bucs give the Chiefs a good game, but right now, it feels like the Chiefs, whether it's in first or second gear, are levels ahead of other teams, especially those trying to follow their model. Let me know what you think about this game in the comments. Coming up next, we go to our fantasy stars of the week, starting off in the NFL. Should be a good segment. A lot of good performances around the league in terms of a fantasy perspective. We'll be right back after this short break.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world?
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Before we get into our second segment of the day here on the show, I do want to remind you, if you wish to interact with the show more directly throughout its entirety, make yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. Great way to contribute and interact. You can do one of two things. Either press that $sign in the comments section, leave a tip or donation, or just leave any questions, comments, or concerns you have throughout the show, whether it be about any of my segments or just any questions in general, looking for some fantasy advice. I love hearing your guys' opinions. It makes the show that much better. But without further ado, let's jump into our second segment of the day, talking about my fantasy stars of the weekend in the NFL. Now, I could have picked a ton of different performances. There were a lot of good ones throughout the week. Certain positions kind of rising above others in certain areas. I feel like this week was hard to gauge as well, just because we know kind of where most of these positions stand and how we view certain players at each position. but I wanted to add a little bit more variety this week. I wanted to give respect to certain players at certain positions that might not be getting it enough, and also respect those who have either refound their form or are just hitting their stride right now. And so, in this segment, you're going to see a lot of different players who might surprise you, but also some who seem right. Without further ado, let's jump right into our segment. Starting off the QB position. This one was very difficult to choose between because I could have picked a number of different players. I could have picked the Stars, Joe Burrow, Lamar Jackson, Josh Allen, even Tua having a decent game. But the one quarterback who impressed me the most is a guy who people have seemed to have forgotten about through no fault of his own because his offensive philosophies have changed and his system has changed. But in certain moments, and even though it was against a Browns defense that, was kind of packing it in for the season, still an impressive performance that proves that this quarterback still has merit in the fantasy football world. And that is Justin Herbert. 18 of 27, 282 yards, 2 touchdowns, 19.48 fantasy points on the day. This is still an impressive performance. Yes, like I acknowledged, the Browns secondary, is a little bit frustrated, playing with a little bit of unease at the moment. Not necessarily having the opportunity to play with a lead as often as they would like. But this is still a defense that's one of the most revered in the league, and the most respected in the league. And Justin Herbert, this season especially, has not necessarily been required to really pick apart defenses like he did against Cleveland. But in this game, it proves, that yes, Justin Herbert's adjusting to this new offense. When he's given the reins, he is someone who is still very effective for you from a fantasy perspective. He's not the most attractive option out there right now, and I understand that. But you can't just not acknowledge a player anymore, even though he still has the talent to put up good performances. It's just that, it's the Harbaugh system. It's a new look on him. And so, certain games he's not going to put up these numbers. But you always have to respect a guy who can go out there, no matter the situation, and still perform, even though sometimes he just isn't required to as often. So I wanted to give Justin Herbert his flowers this week, even though I could have picked a numerous amount of talented quarterbacks around the league. Then at the wide receiver position, got to go with my man Garrett Wilson. There really wasn't a true wide receiver performance, maybe outside of, say Flowers, that I was truly impressed by, because Flowers was one of those guys who I was a little bit skeptical about coming into the year and also throughout the season for Baltimore, but he's really proven himself. But Garrett Wilson, this is a guy who a lot of people were selling on after the Davante Adams trade. But right now, he might just be the X factor, the saving grace of the Jets season. Because I feel like the Jets, their season is over. They still have juice in them to really compete against certain teams. And Garrett Wilson's going to be the reason why. Because the Aaron Rodgers-Davante Adams connection isn't what it once was. But Garrett Wilson is someone who can really elevate his game. Say that, hey, there's a reason why I'm still here, and someone you should want to build around, most importantly, because the future of the Jets now looks a little bit murkier than when initially thought, due to the fact that you don't know if they're going to go down the Aaron Rodgers route or try and invigorate this team with more coaching influence or draft picks. We really don't know. But what I do know is that Garrett Wilson should be the player you build around, and not someone who, detracts from the image and outlook of this team in the near future. So Garrett Wilson, impressive performance from him, 9 catches, 90 yards, 2 touchdowns, including a very impressive highlight reel catch, 30 points for him. And keeping me personally in my fantasy football game this week. So kudos to Garrett Wilson for that performance. I expect big and better things from him in the coming weeks. Let's go to the running back position. And this running back that I picked, I kind of have to apologize to a little bit here, because this was a guy who, throughout the season, even before the season, I really did not like from a fantasy perspective. He was someone who I couldn't justify picking very highly in drafts, someone who I couldn't see carrying you week in, week out, especially with the loss of his quarterback early in the season. But when his quarterback came back, we immediately see the effects of what that could do for him in this offense, and it's suddenly looking like Miami Dolphins can actually compete with certain teams, and Devon Achane is going to be a big part of that going forward. 12 carries, 63 yards, 1 touchdown on the ground, 8 catches, 58 yards for the air, 1 touchdown, 32.1 fantasy points for him on the day. And I really like the tenor of this Miami Dolphins offense with Tua leading the helm. Because I fear with this offense, especially with Devon Achane, was the fact that things might get too sped up for them. And I feel like Tua was going to be a negative contributor in that regard. But obviously, I didn't see much of Tua early in the season after his injury. And the Dolphins really right now are not in a good spot, and Devon Achane suffered for that. But now with Tua back, you're going to see what can come to fruition for this Dolphins offense. And it's really exciting. Not, hindering anyone's development like I thought it would. And Devon Achane now is bolstered and reinvigorated in the fantasy scene. A lot of people were wondering if, he would have any more upside to him now that, Tua's back and he's going to get a lot more touches in the system. I'm going to tell you that I feel like I have to take everything back that I said about him and say yes. Because he's that talented, he's that significant, that impactful for this offense going forward. So I feel like all bets are off on what the Dolphins offense looks like, but all bets are being placed or all in on Devon Achane being a big part of it. Now for the tight end position. And the tight end position this weekend really was a bizarre one. Because, like I said, a lot of them right now, whether they're superstars or not, are really congesting the middle tier of what you want out of a fantasy tight end. This guy, I really can't gauge because he's in a very competitive, high-tempo offense where you never know how many touches you're going to get, how many receptions you're going to get, how many targets you're going to get. And this guy really made the most of Joe Burrow looking his way early and often. Mike Gesicki, 5 catches, 100 yards, 2 touchdowns, 27 points. Now, Mike Gesicki, you would think, is one of those guys who isn't necessarily a high-profile fantasy tight end. And in this Bengals offense, it's justified because of the versatility of it, the volatility of it, and because of the fact Jamar Chase and T. Higgins are one of the better wide receiver duos in the league. But Mike Gesicki, the special thing about him is that the Bengals are a team that can either go on the field in a couple of plays or dink and dunk their way down. And when they do, and Joe Burrow is very incisive in the short to intermediate areas of the field, and when he gets to the red zone, that opens up avenues for a guy like Mike Gesicki to have a big game like he did. So, if this continues to happen, look for not only the Bengals to get back into contention, but Mike Gesicki to be someone who you might value a little bit more. Because I feel like the Bengals are an offense meant to wear you down one way or another. And so, that kind of plays into Mike Gesicki's hands a little bit because they can play fast and loose or they can take it slow. And that's what I like about Mike Gesicki's value, even in that very much of a logjam in that tight end position right now in fantasy. And then the last player I wanted to acknowledge as well, Darnell Mooney. what a huge fantasy prize this season. A lot of people not expecting his rise on that Falcons roster. But boy, has he proven a lot of people wrong. Not necessarily a lot of people from a fantasy perspective, but perhaps Atlanta Falcons fans weren't expecting someone like him to truly be someone you could rely upon in that offense. But boy, has he proven a lot of people wrong. And so, I just want to acknowledge him. 5 receptions, 88 yards, 1 touchdown, 19.8 fantasy points. As someone who, week in, week out, is always going to be a nice option in that Falcons offense. Now look at this Falcons offense. I feel like it should be a little bit more versatile than it actually is. But when it does let loose, Darnell Mooney is the biggest beneficiary. And so I feel like going forward, he's always going to be a fun option to look into or have on your team. He's not always going to be a starting option, but I feel like he has a lot of value just for what he means to the Falcons offense, because they rely on him a lot to add verticality, add savvy to this roster that's not really living up to its standard. And so that's why I feel like Darnell Mooney is a pleasant surprise and deserves his flowers as well as my last fantasy stars of the weekend in the NFL. But let me know what you think in the comments, because coming up next, we're transitioning from our NFL fantasy stars to our college football fantasy stars. Gotta love me some college football, and I want to present to you my top guys from this week. We'll be right back after this short break.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolute.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. And for our third segment of the day here on the show, like I said, we're going to transition a little bit into the world of college football, talking about fantasy stars of the weekend in that department. A lot of these guys on this list are surprises, unsung heroes, or just guys who deserve their respect for what they've achieved throughout their seasons or just their careers as well. And I feel like this list is the most versatile, most diverse of all the lists I've compiled here on the podcast. And I appreciate that, you fantasy college football fans out there, however few or many you may be, seem to like this list, because it just goes to show how deep of a, not necessarily a thing, but how deep of a connection college football and fantasy college football will have for the future of the sport. And if you're a Dynasty League fan even, this adds a lot of value as well. To see so many unsung players who don't get a lot of media attention, who might go to smaller profile schools, how these segments could really help bolster, your mindset towards different modes of fantasy football, different ways to play. And so without further ado, let's jump right into my college football fantasy stars of the week. Starting off with a guy, speaking of unsung heroes, when we talk about this team, the Boise State Broncos, you only think of one guy, Ashton Jeanty, a presumable Heisman favorite, a guy seemingly destined for New York, potentially destined to break some records this season. But we often forget that Boise State is at this level, at this juncture of the season, in a place to compete for the CFP playoff spot because of a team. And on this team is a lot of good players, including this young man at the quarterback position. Oops, wrong guy. Maddox Maxson. 24 of 32, 307 passing yards, 4 touchdowns for a total of 30.8 fantasy points. When we think about the Boise State Broncos, it seems kind of safe to say that Ashton Jeanty is the biggest reason why these Broncos are in contention. Because he is doing incredible things that no one's seen before on a football field, and the hype surrounding him is so high. Such a small profile school. We often forget that the guy in the backfield with him is just as much talent. His performance against a solid San Diego State team that solidifies the reason why Boise State is more than just a quote-unquote group of 5 representative. If they get into the college football playoff, they could potentially be a bracket buster once they get into the CFP, if they do. Because of a guy like Maddox Madsen elevating his game to supplement what Jeanty can do. And not for nothing, another guy on this list from Boise State, I'm going to talk about later, Latrell Caples, can do that as well. This is not just an individual effort here. There's multiplicity to this Boise State Broncos team. And so kudos to Maddox Madsen for making people, perhaps for just one moment, kind of forget about the brilliance of Ashton Jeanty, no matter how hard that is to do. I just wanted to applaud him for that. But speaking of solid quarterbacks, not unsung heroes, guys who are established in their college careers, let's talk of Mr. Jackson Dart a little bit. Kind of separating himself right now as perhaps the best quarterback in the SEC. Who would have thought we'd be saying that this late in the season? We have guys like Carson Beck, Quinn Ewers, Jalen Milroe in this conference. We often forget about a guy like Jackson Dart, but he, throughout his college football career, in this Lane Kiffin offense, has proven to be one of the most explosive, exciting young quarterbacks to talk about. He might not be a high draft pick, but his college career is at a place where a lot of people would be envious of what he's doing. This game is the second game where a SEC quarterback has thrown for over 500 yards and 6 touchdowns. Shout out to the other guy who did it, a former Seattle Seahawk, Drew Lock. That's an impressive stat to tell your friends. The only 2 quarterbacks in the SEC to do that, achieve that stat. And Jackson Dart looked very impressive doing it. And a potential trap game, nonetheless, against an Arkansas team that could have beat them on a good day. 25 of 31, 515 yards, 6 touchdowns for a total of 49.3 fantasy points. We talk about quarterbacks that, from an interesting fantasy perspective, if you are a Dynasty League player, if you are a fantasy college football enthusiast even, Jackson Dart is someone you can get behind. He may not be the attention getter, or he may not even seek attention like other SEC quarterbacks. But he is one of the most solid in the entire conference, and should he have an NFL career, always look out for him as someone who can develop and grow because he's showing impressive traits and numbers to prove it and back it up. Can separate him from a lot of different quarterbacks in that kind of draft discussion. Even if he doesn't even enter this year's draft, he may, I believe, still be eligible for one more year of college play. But wherever his career takes him, just know that he's a very special player that you can't ignore. Not many people come around and put up this stat line in the competitive SEC, and Jackson Dart is one of only 2 people to ever do so, so I wanted to give him his flowers as well. Let's get to some skill position players. Speaking of records being broken, let's talk about Xavier Restrepo. This is a guy this year may have been a little bit disappointing to some people. May not have lived up to the lofty standards of being a wide receiver 1, perhaps the deepest, most impressive, fearsome wide receiver cores in the country. This game proves why. I believe the records he broke in this game were for most receiving yards, most receptions, and I believe most receiving touchdowns by a Miami Hurricane. truly someone who Miami Hurricanes can really appreciate as a player, but not necessarily someone who we've mentioned a ton of on this show, just because, of how well this Miami Hurricanes offense operates, even when star players might not be playing up to par. But Xavier Restrepo, on a record-breaking day, 8 catches, 146 yards, 3 touchdowns, 36.6 points, has to be included on my list. He's been a standout player in his college career, finally with an opportunity to do something special, to end his college career, win a national championship for a Miami team that, by hook or by crook, has looked really good, one of the only remaining unbeaten teams in the country. And Xavier Restrepo, someone, like I said, who may not have been the best this season, may not have lived up to his lofty goals that he set for himself. But he still has the ultimate goal ahead of him. And because of this team, because of its value, because of the players around him, he can rely upon a foundation that wasn't necessarily there at the start of his career. That if he ever plays poorly, he knows his team can lift him up, and he knows that he in turn can lift them up as well in certain performances. Because Miami has it. They have the it factor to be a national championship contender. They have some things on the defensive side to kind of fix, but on the offensive side, they can score with anybody. But it's all going to be about the trust this roster has in each other and the special moments it can create, like Xavier Restrepo's record-setting day on Saturday. And the last player I want to acknowledge is a player who not many people may have heard of, but certainly someone who has been around the block a little bit. A junior at Oklahoma who kind of needed a pick-me-up in, albeit a very cupcake game against an FCS main squad that was not necessarily going to compete in this one, but just showing this offense still has some hope to it. Javonte Barnes, 18 carries, 203 yards, 3 touchdowns, 40.7 fantasy points. And like I said, it's an Oklahoma Sooners team that really hasn't gotten much going on the offensive side of the football, whether it be the struggles of first-year starter Jackson Arnold and then true freshman Michael Hawkins Jr., the struggles of the offensive line, just nothing really working, coalescing for this Oklahoma Sooners team. But, this felt like a wake-up call, and in a game where they felt like they had to get right against an FCS squad, Javonte Barnes proved that there might be some hope in the stretch run to go bowling, get a nice bowl game, because they aren't necessarily going to compete for the CFP. But it just goes to show that sometimes on any given Saturday in college football, any player can have value at any certain time. And yes, sometimes you have to find the matchups. Oklahoma playing a very weak Maine team. It just goes to show that week in, week out, unsung heroes can arise. When I look at this list and look at all these players, the journeys they've gone through, Madsen, questions about him even being the starting quarterback for the Boise State Broncos, bring in former 5-star recruit and USC transfer Malachi Nelson. Nobody really thought that Max Madsen would have a shot. And he's given it, and he's captained this team very well, with Ashton Genty, a special player, in the backfield with him. And ultimately, they're in prime position to be the Group of 5 representative in the CFP for Jackson Dart, a player who a lot of people in the SEC have incredible respect for what he's done in his career at Ole Miss. Perhaps not necessarily going to have a playoff spot to talk about in the latter stages of his career, but I still think there's merit to what he's done to elevate this Ole Miss program. And Xavier Restrepo, another highly respected player in the college football landscape. Someone who has never really had the opportunity to prove himself on a national scale. just because that Miami hasn't had the foundation, the structure, the identity that it needed. And finally, he has a quarterback, a team around him that can bolster him and elevate him and lift him up so that even in a season where he might not be playing up to his standard, on a record-breaking day, he can be appreciated. So that's just about all I have to say for my college football fantasy start. But coming up after this short break, we start my positional rankings for Week 10 of the NFL with my QBs. So you definitely don't want to miss this one. We'll be right back after this short break.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows. Available.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. And for our fourth segment of today's show, we start my weekly positional rankings for Week 10 of the NFL season with my QBs. And this might just be the list that is most contentious for me. The QB position has been such an interesting position to diagnose, to analyze throughout my career here, the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, talking about fantasy football. Because I always try and find certain matchups that you might overlook or might not even think about in terms of starting and sitting the quarterback position. This week, I made some decisions that I feel like will create a lot of skepticism and tension. But I feel confident in them because these are all guys who have shown me something throughout the season that at the very least can prove to me that in certain matchups, some admittedly tougher than others, that they can produce for you at certain levels. So without further ado, let's talk about the QBs who I think will dominate Week 10. And one that I'm going to start off with, the first one on my list, is looking a little bit sketchy after what happened to him this week on the Thursday night game against the Jets. But I still have faith in him. It's perhaps the toughest matchup that I've ever put on this list for any quarterback, and probably will be for the rest of the season. CJ Stroud going up against the Lions. Now, I know what everyone's thinking who's watching here. I think that, this matchup now certainly feels a little bit worse than, before the Jets game. And I was anticipating that CJ Stroud was going to find a certain rhythm. Because out of all the quarterbacks I'm going to name, he has been someone who really struggled to gain any sort of consistency. I feel like all of the quarterbacks I'm going to name either are consistent or, just haven't had much opportunities to show how they can play, especially in a fantasy football perspective. And CJ Stroud certainly has. And I know that this matchup seems a little bit weird for him and highly difficult. But the reason why I feel like in this matchup CJ Stroud can excel is because of the fact when I look at how simple this Texans offense can become, to where he can either rely on Joe Mixon or feel like even without, guys like Collins and Diggs helping him out, that he can pass the football effectively. That CJ Stroud is at a position where it's just all about his own poise. I feel like at this juncture in the season, he's kind of in his own head right now. I feel like the problems that we've seen from him that we didn't see last season stem from either frustration, tension, inadequacy even maybe, or something that is mentally blocking him from performing well. It's not necessarily, anything to do with play calls offensive identity or anything like that. I think it's just a mental barrier that is preventing C.J. Stroud from being, a guy you can rely on week in, week out. And there's no better place for mental barriers to be broken than against the Lions in a very important game for both of these squads. Because the thing is, even if the Texans lose this game, they very well could, because the Lions could be the best team in football right now. C.J. Stroud and the Texans would be in a good place. That's why I'm taking a risk here. Because the Texans are a team that still, despite whether or not they lose or win this game, still feel like in a weak AFC South, they're going to win the division. And so, that's why I feel like C.J. Stroud is someone you should still have hope for. Just because you know there's going to be little to no pressure going forward for him in games of this nature and magnitude. Just because he knows that Texans have headway in this AFC South race. And so that's why, when thinking about fantasy QBs, while he might not be appealing, J. Stroud in certain matchups could play better than you think. And I'm going to take him boldly in this Lions game. And the second guy I want to talk about, Russell Wilson. Let's talk about him a little bit. This is going to be a very interesting game. I'm going to be talking about this game all week. Coming off the bye, though, going up against the Commanders, I feel like Russell Wilson's one of those quarterbacks who, no matter whether it's after the bye or in the flow of the week, always feels like someone who's going to be prepared for whatever task is ahead of him. And the Commanders right now feel like a team that have been very impressive all season, perhaps even more so than Pittsburgh. But yesterday against the Giants showed some vulnerabilities, especially in their defensive side of the football. And I know it sounds crazy considering the fact that, Daniel Jones only had one touchdown pass and 0 yards in the first half. I know that's a weird stat, but it's still, a little bit sketchy for me to consider the Commanders that much more elite than the Steelers. And what I like about the Steelers right now is that they have so much more options available to them with Russell Wilson at the helm, especially in the passing game. And Russell Wilson is not going to sit back and have the game come to him like Daniel Jones. He's going to attack early and often. He's going to be very comfortable under center, play action, rolling out, doing whatever is required of him. And you know that he, especially after a bye, is going to always come ready to play. And so that's why I feel like Russell Wilson is going to be someone to watch this week in fantasy, because even though a lot of people might not want to start him, maybe he's still up there in waiver wires just because nobody knew what the Steelers were going to do at the QB position. But I feel like he's proven himself enough that he can have a lot of value, not even just as a starter, but in a super flex league, 2B2. He's proven that he can do it against teams, yes, not necessarily up this level of the Commanders and going forward of potentially Baltimore, Cincinnati, but he still can prove to be someone who's competent enough to get the job done for the Steelers week in, week out. And the third guy, another kind of weird one, but playing in a much easier matchup than he had this week, Caleb Williams, kind of ran into a buzzsaw. It's a very motivated, all of a sudden, Arizona Cardinals team that's proving that they're more than capable of competing in the NFC West, as scary as it is as a Seattle fan. But Caleb, even though he looked like he regressed a little bit, not as comfortable as he was for the past 3 weeks, he still has merit as someone who can, in certain matchups, find his footing. And not for nothing, this is the easiest one to pick in terms of matchups, because he's playing a Patriots team that has a lot of emotionality to it now with Drake May, a lot of grit now, a lot of toughness to it, but I still think that Caleb Williams, this game, he's going to wipe from his memory, he's going to wipe the slate clean, and go into this Patriots game knowing that he should be a heavy favorite, and he should be confident enough to get back to what we saw in that 3-week sample of some of his best football in the NFL to date. So that's why I feel like Caleb has a lot of value this week. And the last one, this one I kind of feel like could go either way. Because like I said, he was my first NFL fantasy star of the week. But I still feel like, this is going to be one of those trap games potentially where Harbaugh's going to be insistent on one thing when I feel like he can play into the other. So Justin Herbert actually is a little bit more skeptical in my mind than CJ Stroud against the Titans, even though it's a much easier matchup on paper. The reason why I feel that way is because I love Justin Herbert and what he's done against the teams he can potentially pass against, let's say, has been nothing short of impressive. Against the Cardinals, very efficient. Against, like I said, Cleveland, very efficient as well. Probably can be efficient against the Titans, but it's all up to the game plan that Harbaugh puts forth for him. And I feel like, this Titans defense is actually pretty physical. And even though there's a lot of rumors surrounding certain players leaving it, like Joseph Day, and potentially, Harold Landry might be on the market for some teams, it still is one of those defenses where they can kind of drag you into their game a little bit. So it's going to be interesting to see Harbaugh operate in this game. Because while CJ Stroud versus the Lions can go either way, Justin Herbert against the Titans is weird because A, he's elite, but he's not been someone who's been throwing the football downfield as much because of this new look offense. And B, I don't know how week in, week out Jim Harbaugh is going to play things. Is he going to let the reins loose on this game, or is he going to try and stay conservative as possible and win in whatever way he can? Which he can, but you can take your foot off the gas a little bit against teams like the Titans. Allow Justin Herbert to get into the flow of things. Because if they do happen to sneak into the playoffs, you're not going to be able to run the football down people's throats there. So you're going to want to see what Justin Herbert is capable of. We know he's highly capable. So this game's going to be all about Jim Harbaugh here. Do you let Justin Herbert loose, or do you reel him in a little bit? And that's going to determine whether or not this hits on a different level for you come next Sunday. But I should just about do it for this segment. First of many positional rankings, but last but not least for today's show, my Don't Be Surprised If segment to close the show out. We'll be right back after this short break. Hello everyone and welcome back to the last segment here on today's edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network, and it's a good one. One of my favorites to present to you each and every week. My Don't Be Surprised If segment, where I present to you some bold fantasy takes that I believe can be viable plays for this week. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. A couple of these might, be subject to change throughout the week. I might feel a little bit worse about them come game day, but I feel like a couple of them can hit. Others might just as well be long shots, but that's why we do this segment. But without further ado, let me just shut up and get into it. Starting off with Najee Harris, continuing his fantasy hot streak. I believe he's on 4 straight 100-plus yard games, and that just goes to show how this offense opens up, even with Russell Wilson at the quarterback position, because the fears of what would happen with the Pittsburgh Steelers if and when Russell Wilson started at the QB position was how the run game would be viewed going forward. I feel like, Justin Fields brought a little bit more versatility, excitement, invigoration to the run game, whereas Russell Wilson is more going to be of someone who could open up the passing game a little bit down the field. But he's proven that you can still maintain a solid run game, plus add in his effectiveness in the passing game, especially in play action. That's why Najee Harris is someone who's been so highly regarded over the past couple of weeks as a valuable fantasy asset. And I say, against the Commanders, I talked about Russ being a guy who you could start at the QB position. Najee Harris, another guy who I'm really high on at the running back position for this coming weekend. It's going to be an entertaining one to see how he breaks down this Commanders' run defense. I believe the Commanders' run defense is underrated enough to earn my respect. But, Najee Harris is going to bring the physicality. He's going to bring the aggressiveness. And the Steelers will just look primed and ready to go. I feel like they could play a 17-game schedule right now with Russell Wilson at quarterback and not get tired and not, feel like they have to really push to succeed. They did take their foot off the gas a little bit against the Giants there at the end of that game, but I still believe that Najee Harris is going to be a special fantasy player in these next couple of weeks. Then the next one that I want to talk about. This one could hit, but as we saw yesterday against Baltimore, most likely will not. But let's talk about the Broncos defense for a little bit, because they got a little bit shell-shocked against Baltimore. And they were going up against a very good Baltimore Ravens offense that could use the speed of Lamar Jackson, the intelligence of him and Derrick Henry together to just go to town on a Broncos defense that up to that point hadn't really faced an opponent like that, but still was very impressive on the defensive side of the football. This prediction kind of predicates itself on, this actually being a very much defensive game, Broncos-Chiefs. But I feel like, the reason why I'm a little bit skeptical about this one over some others is because, how much do I want to place stock in this Broncos defense that is still very young, mind you, continuing to try and be as effective as possible in this very congested AFC playoff picture. Because they are still 5-4. They can kind of control their own destiny if, they continue to play well and take care of business against teams they should take care of business against. But they were exposed, better or worse, against Baltimore. And I can't ignore that factor. The Chiefs, yes, aren't as potent offensively as Baltimore, but still, can grind you into submission with their style of play. That's why I feel like this one, I'm still kind of holding out hope for, because it's looking less and less like a hit day after day. But I did say there would be in a loss, the Chiefs. So I'm not going to go so far as to say the Broncos defense will dominate and it will result in a win. I think that they will lose this game. But the first part is going to have to be highly dependent on whether or not this team can prove that they can come back from something like this, can come back from a debacle against an opponent as physical as the Ravens and go up against an unbeaten team in the Chiefs, who have been beating them up in the AFC West for the past 5 years or so. So that's the big question. Can the Broncos wipe the slate clean and just get down to business and try and contain the Chiefs in this one coming up? And then the next one. And this one is going to come back to bite me in the face. But I still have a glimmer of hope just because of how the Cowboys' offense has changed due to Dak's injury. I did say the Cowboys would upset the Eagles behind the play of Tolbert and Ferguson. And the reason why I still feel like there's a small percentage chance that one of these things can happen, maybe not the upset anymore, is because Dak Prescott, I feel like, was tracking this team down. You might be surprised to hear that, but I feel it's the truth. The reality was, Dak Prescott was so consumed with him and CeeDee Lamb being the stars just because of the money tied to them, because of the storyline surrounding why they wanted to stay in Dallas. It was pushing this narrative that him and CeeDee had to be stars, and it showed in their play. And this injury, I hope that he has a speedy recovery from, but could prove that maybe Dak was a bit of part of the problem. I feel that Cooper Rush, yes, he's not someone who's going to push the ball down the field as much as a Dak Prescott, but he's going to play safe football, and he's going to utilize as many weapons as possible to get this offense moving. And against the Eagles, I don't necessarily think the Eagles should be concerned about being an upset watch now, but I think I'm going to see, and you're going to see some things that we haven't seen before. Guys like Tolbert and Ferguson coming into their own. Just because there's now less pressure on these role player types or these skill position players who could be stars if they were given the chance but just haven't necessarily gotten that chance to really prove that they themselves can contribute. Because a lot of the frustrations might come from them in this Cowboys locker room because of the fact they've not been used to full effect. But now, I think we're going to see a lot of these players really come into their own on the stretch for the Cowboys here. Maybe not to the tune of some upsets, but to the tune of actual offensive identity. The fourth one I have here, kind of along that same through line, Jake Ferguson in the fantasy top 5. Might have to lower that number a little bit. Temper expectations there for him just because of the quarterback change. But I do feel like Jake Ferguson has a lot of upside to him, even with Cooper Rush at the helm right now. So I feel like the reason why a lot of people are low on Jake Ferguson has been because of the Dak Prescott situation, but also because of the fact he himself feels like he could have more say in here. Because when I look at the layout of the Cowboys offense, it's Dak, CeeDee, and a huge drop-off to number 3, but I think that number 3 player is Jake Ferguson, potentially a little bit more important of an X factor than potentially Dak, even when Dak is healthy. Just because of the physicality he can bring to this team. I think they lack that in terms of their style of play. They don't have enough grit and physicality at the point of attack to really hurt teams. And so that's why I feel like Jake Ferguson can take this opportunity without Dak Prescott to prove himself to be an integral part of this team's foundation. And not to the tune, like I said. Both of these are highly contingent on, separate things happening. But small details within these predictions could take root. So I'm saying that Jake Ferguson this week would have been in the top 5 in my opinion had Dak played, but might have to be taken down a peg just because of Cooper Rush. But I still think, this prediction can hold true, funnily enough, because of Cooper Rush as well. So this is a weird one where you kind of feel like the QB change might temper expectations surrounding it, but could be a interesting characteristic of what makes this take stand out. So that's why I felt like I'd still include it here for you. The last one I want to talk about to end today's show, Josh Allen, not a top 5 quarterback at the position. I have to look up this game again because I'm completely blanking on who they're playing. But I feel like, sometimes this season for Josh Allen has been too good to be true as he faces the Colts. So that's an interesting matchup there. But I feel like, again, what I was saying is that some moments for Josh Allen this season have felt a little bit too good to be true. I still love him as a player, still love him as a fantasy prospect. But I feel like something's going to give in a game like they're going to be playing against the Colts, a team that can frustrate you enough to really make it a little bit more difficult to settle in. I feel like, Josh Allen is at its best when people least expect it. You know what I mean? In games such as this, you kind of feel like there's a fear factor involved where he's going to potentially push a little bit too far. And that's why I feel like you can't always pencil him in as a top 5 guy week in, week out. There are going to be games where he's going to look like the best thing on earth. But there are going to be games, actually trap games as well, that he's not going to perform up to his standards. And this generally feels like it. Because I feel like the Colts defense is getting respected. They had a fantastic performance last night against the Vikings. And they can do it again to an even more experienced offense in the Bills. And I feel like there's going to be a lot of vulnerabilities shown in this Bills team in this one. And that's why I feel like Josh Allen might not live up to people's expectations for him this week. But I will just about do it for today's show. Thank you all for tuning in. This from the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always with the GSMC Sports Network. I've been Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for tuning into today's show. If you want more content as this, such as exclusive short content as well, consider liking, following, and subscribing to this show and the network. Also, if you want to interact with shows more directly, please consider making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Things, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube as well. You can do one of two things. Click the Super Chat button, leave a tip or donation, or just leave a question, comment, or concern about the show. Other than that, we'll actually be back on Wednesday. I'm going to skip tomorrow's show. Go vote. And we'll be back 3:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Wednesday. But other than that, I am out for a couple days.